Hello, I'm Bernadine Lennon, a member of the Greene-Dreher Historical Society, where I serve on the board of directors. Today I'm going to give a presentation on the 1955 flood, its cause, effect, and lasting impact. Before I begin, though, I'd like to show you where we are located in northeastern Pennsylvania. On the map, you'll see an arrow and a star, which indicates where South Sterling is located, and that's also the location of our museum. We're south of Lake Wallenpaupack, and throughout the presentation, I will be referring to the Greene-Dreher community. Now, 200 years ago, when this area was settled by German families in the 1820s, they purchased land on either side of the Wallenpaupack Creek. Their 1,700 acres was divided approximately equally between the families, and their land extended to the west of the creek into Dreher Township and to the east into Greene Township. So each family had a foot in each township and each county, so to speak, when they settled here. And the term Greene-Dreher has continued on through the years. For example, there's the Greene-Dreher Volunteer Fire Association, the Greene-Dreher Sterling Fair, the Greene-Dreher Alumni Association, and of course the Greene-Dreher Historical Society. The two townships have been tied together through a common history, through organizations, and through marriage. And so I'll begin the presentation now on the history of the 55 flood. Now, when the 1955 flood occurred, weather forecasting was in its infancy and was much different than it is today. The tools included were very basic, such as thermometer, barometer, hygrometer, which measures humidity, rain and snow gauges, wind instruments to measure wind velocity and direction. All of these instruments were put into a box by weathermen and women and with a radio transmitter and sent into the atmosphere by balloon, where radio signals would return to Earth what the temperature, moisture, and air pressure was during ascent. Now, additional weather observations were gathered by transatlantic ship captains and airplane pilots who would report back what they observed. Meteorologists took this information from various sources and plotted it using grease pencil on plexiglass. They had to have a lot of imagination because there were very few data points for collecting the information. Now, weather forecasting in the 1950s has been described as someone trying to describe an elephant that's standing behind a barn with only its tail showing. You don't know whether the elephant is large or small, its strength, where it's traveling, or whether it's going to sit down and stay there. So the information was very sketchy. Now, we might think that communications during this time was not very adequate, but in fact, 63% of American households had television sets, 72% had telephones, and over 90% had radios. So if there had been a way to promulgate or determine the weather forecast, there would have been a way to promulgate it. But local newspapers, radios, and television stations reported basically current conditions. Severe weather forecasts were promulgated by the National Weather Service, but they basically only forecast the next 24 hours of weather. And that only covered about a 15,000 square mile area. Weather forecasters in the 1950s lacked three major weather tools in order to forecast the weather: weather satellites, Doppler radar, and computer modeling. Now, at the time of the 1955 flood, there were no weather satellites to give meteorologists the big picture of weather patterns across the globe. Now, these tools are very important in tracking hurricanes. For example, cloud height can provide information on the severity of the thunderstorms within a hurricane. But the first weather satellite wasn't launched until 1959. Now, radar had been used during World War II by the military, and Navy meteorologists saw that when looking at the radar, they also could see cloud cover and precipitation. So that was the beginning of using radar to help in weather forecasting. However, the first network of Doppler radar wasn't put in place until after the 1955 flood. The first computer model ever run for meteorological purposes was in 1950. But because of its infancy, there were often breakdowns, and it took a long time to process data, so before it could give a forecast. Now, I wanted to show you a little more detail about the area that was affected by the 1955 flood. The blue line that you see is the Wallenpaupack Creek as it was originally in the 1950s. And you'll see how it meanders north, south, east, and west. There are a lot of oxbows in the creek, and flooding was pretty common in Newfoundland and in the Greentown area at the north end of, or at the top of the screen, especially during spring when there were the snow melts. And it was very common for the streets of Newfoundland and Greentown to be flooded. By street, I mean Main Street. There aren't really any blocks in Newfoundland. It's just a straight road through town. People recall using canoes and rowboats to travel from one place to another in the town. Back in the 1800s, pastors of the Moravian Church in Newfoundland reported to their bishop in Bethlehem about the snowmelt rain that came and the flooding that ensued. But again, it never did long-lasting and severe damage. It was just something people coped with. But the most devastating natural disaster to impact the Greene-Dreher Township area occurred on August 18th and 19th when Hurricane Diane moved through the area. This was one of the most destructive storms that the East Coast had ever had at that time. There were 200 dead as a result of the storm and over $750 million in property damage along the eastern seaboard. Pike and Monroe counties were particularly hardest hit. The Broadhead Creek, which flows down by Stroudsburg, had a 30-foot high wall of water that it generated, and it disintegrated a building that had been part of a children's camp south of Analomic. And it swept away 46 campers, most of them children, and another 32 people died in East Stroudsburg. Now, to understand why this storm was so devastating compared to other hurricanes that came through the area, it's important to understand the conditions leading up to it. There were two factors that increased the amount of moisture brought inland by storms during the summer of 1955. First, an unusually persistent southerly wind and abnormally warm water south of New England made more moisture available to storms that formed. Secondly, the jet stream was much farther north than usual, and this resulted in hurricanes traveling farther north and west before being steered out toward the east and to sea. These factors made rains in New England more intense, and they contributed to Diane regaining strength and moving over Pennsylvania. Now, additionally, the summer of 1955 was a particularly dry summer. Rainfall was up to 50% below normal. And while Diane may have caused damage in and of itself, the destruction was intensified because Hurricane Connie had passed through the area a week prior. Connie had formed on August 3rd and followed a northerly and westerly track with speeds between 125 and 140 miles an hour, which classified it as a Category 4 hurricane. It hit North Carolina on August 8th. Rains from Connie hit this area on August 12th and 13th. Now, there were some rivers that overflowed, but most of the rainfall was absorbed into the soil. The ground was saturated with some 6 to 12 inches of rain, and the ground could not absorb any more rainfall from another storm. On the eastern seaboard, the storm caused about $86 million in damage, and 4 people died as a result of the storm. You'll see Connie's track on this graph in the dashed and dotted line that comes up hitting North Carolina on the 12th of August, and then heading up over the Great Lakes by the 15th. Now, Diane was first detected over the Atlantic Ocean on August 11th, about 400 miles northeast of San Juan, Puerto Rico. At the time when Hurricane Connie was fizzling on the 15th, Hurricane Diane was classified as a hurricane. It traveled north and west with speeds of about 120 miles an hour, making landfall on August 17th at Wilmington, North Carolina. The storm weakened rapidly, and by nightfall, it could no longer be classified as a hurricane. The Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. issued its final warning at 11 o'clock at night on August 17th, believing the worst was over. Local residents listening to the weather wouldn't have thought anything more of Diane and taking no precautions or preparations. Now, forecasters downplayed the threat of Diane after it weakened over Virginia. However, a trough of low pressure over eastern Pennsylvania caused the tropical moist air from Diane to collide with cooling air at the Appalachian foothills, resulting in unexpected and additional rainfall. Afterward, the Weather Bureau admitted its error, and because it did not foresee that the storm would be gaining strength. The rain from Diane had little opportunity to penetrate the saturated soil, and the high intensities of rain caused streams and rivers, which had virtually dried up or returned to normal after Hurricane Connie, to become raging torrents in just a few hours. Many tributaries and rivers rose rapidly as the rains fell, and the floodwaters overwhelmed the river valleys. Smaller areas in some smaller rivers in some areas rose as much as 10 feet higher than in previous floods. The extreme height, the quickness of the rise, and the swiftness of the current added to the destructiveness of the storm. In areas where there were no stream channels, new channels were formed, undermining buildings and roads. The Delaware River, the Lackawaxen, and the Lackawanna River all rose between 10 and 21 feet above flood stage. The Wallenpaupack Lake rose 17 feet overnight. Hundreds of people downstream from the dam at Lake Wallenpaupack fled, fearing that it would break, but the dam did hold back the 31.5 billion gallons of water that resulted from the storm. Survivors recall that houses were ripped from their foundations, cars were thrown about like tinker toys, and buildings were broken apart. The flood deposited a large amount of debris in streams and floodplains. Bridge piers were underpinned, causing many to collapse. They were undermined. Homes and businesses were destroyed, and people were isolated. Now in Greentown, where 10 deaths occurred, the east branch of the Wallenpaupack Creek had periodic flooding. Again, it was mainly in the spring. People might be isolated for a short period of time because of the high water, especially where the east branch met with the south branch. But the water would soon recede and their homes were never damaged to any great extent. But on the night of August 18th, 1955, the waters of the east and south branches of the Wallenpaupack did not recede before a death and destruction occurred. In the brief period of a few hours, the water rose to new heights and scoured out about a mile of township road in and around Greentown. It washed out 6 bridges and destroyed 5 homes and a grange hall. Believing the storm was like all other storms that had come through previously, many of the residents refused to leave their homes when given the opportunity. They steadfastly believed that they were safer where they were than risking a move through rushing water to safety. The Phillips, Smith, and Marico families lived in Greentown. They lived within feet of each other, and they would have been located along the east branch of the Wallenpaupack, just to the left of where the word Greentown is on the map. 20-year-old Raymond Phillips survived the flood in Greentown. Living next to the creek, flooding was not unusual, but it was never severe, and his basement, in fact, never flooded. But during Hurricane Diane, it did. He attempted to move his bedridden aunt from the second floor bedroom, but was unable to. He saw a wall of water coming toward him, and once the dam that had been formed at the bridges broke and this wall of water came, it washed away the home's foundation, leaving only half the house, hurling it into the rushing water. Of the 5 people living in the house, only Raymond survived. His aunt, mother, and grandmother were found in the house, drowned, and his father was discovered 2 weeks later, downstream, also having drowned. Now, Pearl and Bob Smith, who were neighbors of the Phillipses, had 2 daughters. One of their daughters was staying with a friend on the night of August 17th. And the 3 of them, when the water started to rise from the basement into the first floor, went up to the attic. And they could see the water rising up the steps when suddenly it stopped. And they thought the water was receding and the worst was over. But in fact, the house had come off its foundations and was being sent downstream. Pearl was hit on the back of the head and drowned. Her husband Bob and daughter Barbara were found later the next day clinging to trees downstream, and they were rescued. 51-year-old Helen Marico was babysitting her 4 grandchildren ages 6 months to 6 years. Their parents worked in Connecticut during the week and were on their way home on the night the flood hit. And they got as far as Ledgedale, perhaps about 3 miles from Greentown. And they could go no further, and they didn't know what was happening in Greentown. Raymond Phillips went to the Marico house by rowboat, attempting to get Helen and the grandchildren into the boat to safety. But Helen was in a state of panic. She pushed the boat away, fearing that they would be in a more dangerous situation in the boat as opposed to staying in the house. Um, as a result, she and the 4 children drowned. One death occurred in South Sterling, where 300 tourists and summer boarders had been staying. All the roads and bridges leading into South Sterling had been washed away. Newfoundland, with bridges to its north, east, and south, was isolated. The main street was covered with mud, wells were polluted, sewage systems and graves were washed out. Along the Wallenpaupack north, 17 bridges were washed out. For the first time in Northeast Pennsylvania history, Army helicopters were used for humanitarian and medical purposes. Food was brought in. The helicopters landed in farmers' fields along Lake Wallenpaupack, where medical teams administered typhoid shots after the flood. The elementary and high schools in Newfoundland delayed opening for a month while cleanup was taking place. The GDS fair, which occurs at the end of August, early September, never took place that year because of the damage to the fairgrounds. People worked round the clock to bring some semblance of order to the town. Now, this shows Greentown, where the 3 families suffered the most deaths, and their houses would have been just right to the image on the top left of the screen. The roof that's there is actually the roof of the Grange Hall. The building was destroyed, and the Marico, Phillips, and Smith families would have lived between there and the creek. You can see also in that image that the Route 507 bridge has been completely washed out. The bottom right image shows Bob Smith being brought to safety on a lifeline by PPL crew the following day from the flood. His daughter Barbara was brought to safety the same way. These images show Newfoundland at both ends of Newfoundland, north and south, and Main Street in the middle with the 8 inches of mud that was left by the flood. South Sterling, with its tourists and boarders, was isolated. You can see that there was the debris was feet deep, up to 3 to 4 feet deep in the on the roads, and this is where one man passed away, drowned because of the flood. Now, what I found most interesting in researching the flood was the selfless acts of people following the flood. One of those was Geraldine Miller, who was a 17-year-old high school junior. She had been taking swimming lessons from the Red Cross that summer and was working at a boarding house adjacent to the Wallenpaupack Creek. During the night of the flood, she heard the raging flood waters of the Wallenpaupack Creek. You could hardly see anything at night because of the rain, but she did hear a woman's voice crying for help from the direction of the creek. So she and some men went down to the creek to see if they could find the woman, and they determined that she was actually located across the creek, clinging to some branches or a tree. So the men tied a rope onto Geraldine, and she began swimming across the creek. She started on a 186-foot journey through the muddy, swirling, debris-filled water. You can just imagine all the tree limbs and branches and rocks that were being hurled through the stream because of the fast floodwaters. The journey took her 3 hours. Sometimes it was necessary to take the rope into her mouth and hold it between her teeth so that her hands would be free to clear away debris, or maybe to hold on to a tree to get her strength back. Several times she ran out of rope and more rope had to be added for her to reach the woman, but she finally did rescue Mildred Foss Green McNeese, and she guided her to safety to shore. Now, Geraldine's heroism was honored locally by many organizations. She received the Certificate of Merit from the American Red Cross, and the Carnegie Hero Commission awarded her the Carnegie Medal, which is given to civilians who save or attempt to save lives under harrowing conditions. There were many people who stepped up in order to help their neighbor. There was no FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, or Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency at this time. Our local druggist, Willis Gilpin, was designated the Civil Defense Coordinator. He said the stench from Newfoundland because of the mud could be smelled 5 miles away for weeks to come. Justice of the Peace Elmer Haig was designated in charge of cleanup. Farmers brought their tractors with scrapers into Newfoundland to scrape away the mud and debris. The Monroe County Civil Defense sent 100 volunteers to our area. Another 100 came from Honesdale. Men and young boys came from Moscow, Hamlin, Lake Ariel, and Gouldsboro to help out. College students from East Stroudsburg also helped clean out people's homes and basements. The high school in Newfoundland was designated the Red Cross headquarters, and Principal Paul Ryder was in charge of the Red Cross work. Fortunately, Newfoundland had 3 doctors at this time. Dr. Yordell in the upper left-hand corner was in charge of health and sanitation, and he coordinated the administration of typhoid shots. Dr. Lupko was in charge of water purification. And the school nurse, Jean Burdick, helped with the medical needs of the community. Members of the community helped recover the dead. A temporary morgue was set up in the basement of one of the buildings. The graves at the Albright Bennett Cemetery were flooded, and some of them flowed, some of the caskets flowed downstream. In fact, if you go to that cemetery today, there's an area in the rear of the cemetery where there's a pile of grave markers because that were recovered following the flood, and they could not be associated with any particular graves, and so they remain there to this day. These are images of Hawley, just north of Lake Wallenpaupack. There are 2 rivers or creeks that meet in Hawley. On the upper left-hand image, you'll see the arrow pointing to Middle Creek, which is also the same water that you see in the image to the right between the 2 buildings. That creek overflowed. You can see how it undermined the foundations of the building. The other body of water coming into Hawley is the Lackawaxen and that river, and that's shown at the bottom of that upper image. When those 2 bodies of water met in Hawley, it caused a lot of destruction, including 1 death. You can see the dam at Wallenpaupack in the lower image and the water flowing over the spillway. Now, it's estimated that $1.5 million of direct damage was caused by the 1955 flood along the Wallenpaupack Creek and its tributaries. The state of Pennsylvania spent over $130,000 cleaning up streams and the floodplain following the flood. As a result of the significant damage caused by the flood, steps were taken to mitigate damage from future storms. On September 4th, 1956, ground was broken for the Newfoundland Channel project. The purpose of this $75,000 project was to relocate a major portion of the Wallenpaupack Creek from the business and residential area of Newfoundland to the east, and in order to prevent future damage and flooding to the area. Now, these maps or aerial views show the Wallenpaupack in blue before the Wallenpaupack Channel was created. And the two parallel lines that follow the creek to the east or right of it or along the creek itself is the Newfoundland Channel. In the upper image, you'll see where the creek was also relocated and widened in 1963. Now, for the first decade or two, this worked fine. And in fact, there has not been any major flooding to this area since the 1955 flood. There has been flooding, but no deaths or major property damage. However, when the Army Corps of Engineers straightened the channel, it was done in the hope of allowing unrestricted water to move more quickly, thus reducing the risk of flood. Now we know that's the worst possible thing to do to an ecosystem. When the channel was straightened out, it removed all the natural tendencies that create a healthy and stable environment for aquatic life. The uniformity of the water flow reduces habitat types and the depth and velocity of the water. There's less oxygen in the water, and the aquatic life becomes less diverse. All this trickles up to fish that forage for microbes and for game fish. In drier parts of the year, a lack of water pools and riffles can dramatically affect fish life and prevent upstream migration. These conditions also are ripe for stream bank erosion and other habitat degradation. So this law of unintended consequences lasted up until a few years ago in 2019. This slide shows various images of the Wallenpaupack Creek before the flood in 1939. You can see how it meanders in the upper left-hand corner of that image through Newfoundland, and then following the Newfoundland Channel, you can see the parallel lines of the stream bank, of the channel bank rather, and the dark line is the flow of the Wallenpaupack Creek. By 1969, the channel began to narrow a bit, and by 2019, you can see that gravel bars had formed. There was a lot more narrowing of the channel. Vegetation started growing in the channel. Now, the Lake Wallenpaupack Watershed Management District, along with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, partnered with Dreher Township, private property owners, the Greene-Dreher Sterling Fair Association, for easements to complete restoration work on the Wallenpaupack Creek. Over a year's period of time, approximately 3,600 feet of the Newfoundland Channel was restored to attract aquatic life. 5 different types of habitat improvements were installed, including 35 log structures. Some of these structures help direct water into the middle of the channel and keep potential erosion from the shoreline. They help create scour holes and places where fish can rest while they are migrating. 41 species of wildflowers for pollinators and wild grasses were planted. The wild grasses were to improve topsoil stabilization and create pockets of natural habitat. Now, in 1959, a comprehensive flood control plan was prepared by several federal agencies. The plan proposed 16 floodwater detention structures in Greene-Dreher townships. Of the 16 that were planned, only 7 were actually constructed. And those are noted with the orange triangles on this slide. And you'll see that they're primarily in tributaries leading to the Wallenpaupack Creek. These, again, show where those high hazard dams and detention facilities are. It's estimated that these structures prevented $300,000 of damage when we had a hurricane in 1973, and $73,000 of prevented in 1974. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 major technologies that have had lasting impact on weather forecasting. And they were weather satellites, Doppler radar, and computer modeling. The advancements in communications, computers, and the amount of weather information available today is extraordinary. It's been said that if you had been a weather forecaster 50 years ago, the amount of data that's available now, had you had it then, would have taken you 40 years to collect. That's how much the weather forecasters now have at their disposal. They have dozens of computer models which can be adjusted based on the information that's put in them. There are computer models for tropical weather, severe weather, aviation weather. Satellites track wildfires and their intensity. They monitor smoke and dust, tropical cyclone tracking and their intensity. They monitor lightning, which is an indicator of severe weather. However, as good as these tools are, we don't know whether they would have been any good to the people in 1955 who lived in Greene-Dreher townships. During natural disaster, there's a tendency for storm victims to refuse to leave their homes that they have built or lived in for a long period of time, or leave their businesses which they've built up. And this is especially true if the storms in the past have not caused severe damage. They doubt the reliability of the weather forecasts, or like the people of Greene-Dreher townships, they base their decisions on what happened in the past, not thinking this time might be different. But it's a warning to all of us that we need to be prepared for natural disasters. We owe it to those who died before us in natural disasters, who did not heed the warnings. We need to be prepared and to take precautions and to have an evacuation plan. Now, a collection of first-person accounts, including oral histories, letters, and personal essays from residents who remember the 1955 flood and its impact on the Greene-Dreher community, were collected and published by the Greene-Dreher Historical Society on the 60th anniversary of the flood in 2015. The book, Flood Remembered, is available from the Greene-Dreher Historical Society, along with a number of other publications produced by the Historical Society. You can visit us at greendreherhs.org, where you'll see our shop page and all the publications and their prices that are available. The website also lists upcoming events, history of our area, how to get in touch with us. We welcome feedback concerning this presentation, certainly. And if you have any recollections of the 1955 flood, we would love to hear them. Additionally, if you would like to contact us about any research questions you have, please do so. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for your attention.